Thank you so much. It's been my privilege to share with you over these past few weeks, at least, this summer, and what an honor it has been. I've enjoyed it very, very much. I told the first service this morning that if I lived within 50 miles of Pittsburgh, I would attend Flag Church. You guys are awesome, and thank you for your reception, kindness to me, and the Spirit of God I feel in this place. Thank you. You are awesome. If you have a Bible with you this morning, I'd like you to take it and turn to the book of Acts, chapter 27, where I would like to look with you, continuing, and I started last week talking about storms. Now, we all know what a natural storm is, of wind, and rain, and hail, a hurricane, a tornado, those kind of storms. But I want to focus on some of the storms that come into our lives that are not natural, but they may be physical, they may be financial, they may be relational, they may be that call that comes in the middle of the night. And I want to focus on what God wants you to understand when you face one of these storms. Now, immediately when I talk about storms, everybody says, well, I know God will take care of me. God will see me through the storm. But last week, I wanted you to understand that sometimes God warns us about storms to come, and he wants us to avoid unnecessary storms. In our story in the book of Acts, Paul is on a ship on his way to Rome and to stand before Caesar. And as the ship made its way to Crete in a harbor called Fair Havens, he said to the men, he had a word from the Lord. He said, men, I see that our voyage, if we keep going, it's wintertime, and if we keep going, is going to be disastrous and bring destruction not only to the ship, but to our lives. And he warned them. God warned them through Paul about a storm coming. But just like so many of us, when God warns us, they didn't listen. The centurion listened to the experts, and last week I shared with you, we got to be careful who we're listening to. He listened to the experts who said, oh, we can make it. He listened to the majority. Everybody said, let's go on. And he listened to them, and he listened to the circumstances. They had a south gentle wind. Why, this looks great. Let's sail on. God said, don't go. And in spite of that, they went ahead. And now they find themselves in the midst of a storm. How many of you realize God warns us, often in his word, through a message that the preacher may share with you, through a word from parents or Christian friends? God warns us about storms in our lives, hoping that we can avoid them. So what do we do then when we do find ourselves in the storm, whatever of our own making, or possibly a storm that comes that is totally out of the blue and nothing you can do? That's what I want to talk to you about this morning. What should your reaction be when you face a devastating storm? Now, next Sunday, Lord willing, I want to share with you about some of the reasons God has for storms in our lives. For when storms come, God often wants to teach and change us in the midst of the difficulties we find ourselves in. And I want you to understand a little bit about the why of some of the storms that come next Sunday, Lord willing. But today, maybe you're here and you're finding yourself in a difficult place, in circumstances that seem almost overwhelming to you, and you don't know what you're going to do. How does God want us to react in the midst of the storm? I want you to look with me at these sailors on board this ship that found itself in a storm and how they reacted, and then how also the Apostle Paul, God's man on the ship, reacted. And I want us to see today how God wants us to respond to the storms we face. If you have your Bibles, Acts chapter 27, reading at verse 14. Paul in the ship. Before very long, verse 14, a wind of a hurricane force called a northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and swept down and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed through the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes underneath the ship itself to hold it together.
Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Now, these sailors and the Apostle Paul on the ship find themselves in the midst of a great storm. They are caught by the wind, and they give up all hope of a destination. They are now just trying to survive day by day, moment by moment. And the ship is driven this way and that by the storm. Note what these sailors did when they found themselves in the storm. Note what it says in verse 15. Their first reaction was, the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it. We allowed the wind to determine where we went. We gave way to it, and we were driven along. The first thing that a storm will do in your life is unanchor you. It will rip out all of the bearings and all of the holdings of your life. Storms cause us to begin to drift. We begin to lose sight of everything but the storm itself, and we forget that there's a God that's in control of things. We begin to believe we cannot fight against the storm. We begin to believe that it's more than we can handle. And so we just let go and let the circumstances of the storm drive us. We lose motivation. We forget where we're headed. We forget what we know for sure. The sailors, they found themselves in darkness, didn't know where they were going, and they just let the waves direct them and beat against them. We will say things like, what's the use? I can't fight it anymore. I'll just go with the flow. I've been trying and trying and trying, and I can't get on top. So I'll just let it guide me. And I often see people just drifting in the midst of their storm because they're allowing their circumstances to determine not only their attitude, but the direction of their lives. They're allowing themselves to be driven and directed by the storm. And these sailors were moving along as though they were in a fog, not knowing where they were going. Instead of keeping a direction, they allowed the wind to drift them. I see so many people when they face circumstances adversely in their lives that they just begin to drift. Notice the second reaction of these sailors. It's found in verse 18. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. The sailors began to throw everything they could overboard to lighten the ship. Their first reaction was just to let the wind direct them. They were being driven back and forth by it. And the next thing was to discard everything they had. Often we are tempted to throw things vital to our lives overboard when we find ourselves in a storm. I find people, when they're facing devastating circumstances or a hard place, some of the first things I find them throwing overboard are common sense and reason, but they'll continue to throw away their faith. They will distance themselves from family and friends and say, what's the use? There's nothing that can be done. The values that they've hung on to, they'll just give them up. Why fight it? Why try to live for God? It's not getting me anyplace. They give up on their dreams. They run from relationships. They question their beliefs. Most often they stop going to church and distance themselves from church family. The very thing, they are discarding the very things that will help them the most in the midst of a storm. I find people in the midst of a storm forget about God. They stop reading their Bible. You see, the storm is dictating where they're going. The storm dictates how they feel today. The storm dictates how and where they go. And they've discarded, well, it's no use. All those things, I just give it up. And they push away the very things that will help them in the midst of the storm until they find themselves alone. The sailors were being driven by the storm. The sailors had discarded all the cargo, and now they discarded even the ship's tackle, the things that were on board, the furniture, their belongings. They're throwing everything overboard. And their final reaction is found in verse 20, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging. We finally gave up all hope of being saved. Finally, the sailors, in their desperation in the storm, gave up all hope of being saved. How often we get to that point? Pastor, it's useless. I've done everything I can. There's nothing I can do. It's just hopeless. I give up. I can't fight anymore. And the last thing we discard is hope and faith in a God that can do anything. And when people discard their hope, they've lost everything. It's at this point you find people committing suicide. It's at this point you find people dropping out of life. It's at this point you find people turning to a bottle or pills or whatever it is to destroy their lives because there is no hope left in them. I wonder today, are you facing a situation that you feel is almost hopeless and you're in a storm? I don't know the circumstances of anybody in this room, but my friend, storms come to all of us all of the time. And maybe today you're at that point of despair. But one point I want to make to you this morning is these sailors on board that ship had forgotten and did not realize that there was a God that was still in control of everything. There was a God that can still do anything in the midst of any circumstance. And they had forgotten and did not realize that he was there. But there was one on board that did. And you know the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul stood up after almost 2 weeks of the storm and stands up to the men there and says to them, listen, God's going to spare us. Let's read it. Acts chapter 27, verse 21. You have your Bible? Verse 21 says, after the men had gone a long time without food, almost 2 weeks, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. How often God warns us of a storm to come. And Paul reminded them, God told you this was coming. If you would have listened, you would not be here today. But now, you're in it. But now, he says, verse 22, I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men. Keep up your courage, men. These are the men who have given up all hope of being saved. Keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. Paul stands up and says, hey, fellas, you've given up all hope. Let me tell you something. God is still in control, and we're all going to be saved. An angel stood by me last night. And the sailors look at him and wonder, has he cracked under the pressure of the storm? But Paul stands up and says, take courage. God is going to deliver us. So I wonder this morning, if you're in such a storm or you're in such a place, I want you to listen to this fanatic named Paul. And I want you to understand why, in the midst of this storm, he could say these things. For Paul held on in the midst of the same storm these sailors are in to three tremendous truths that became anchors to his life that allowed him to stand up and say, I believe God is going to deliver us all. Note what Paul says. Note what he first says. The first anchor that he believed in is found in verse 23. He said, last night an angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me. He said, I believe God is with me. God has never left me. He sent his angel last night to stand beside me and remind me of that. Sometimes in the midst of the storm, you forget that God is there. Sometimes in the midst of the storm, you forget that God has promised to walk with you. You may not see him. He may seem miles away, but he is always there. And he sent his personal angel. Paul, I want you to know, I'm right here with you. Hasn't God promised you in his word, I will never leave you nor forsake you. You are never out of my sight. I am always watching over you. You are my children. I cover you. Hasn't he promised always to be with us? And this is why Paul could stand up and say, men, have courage. God is here. God is with us. I love the story of Dr. Tony Campolo. It's an older author. He's my age. I guess that's older. Says that when he was a boy growing up in a congested and bustling city, his mother arranged a teenage girl who lived nearby to walk him from school at the end of the day. For this, she paid the girl a nickel a day. But Tony, thinking that he was so old and mature, rebelled in the second grade, and he told his mother, I'll walk myself to school, and if you give me a nickel a week, I will be extra careful, and you can keep the rest of the 20 cents, and we'll all be better off. After a period of pleading, begging, little Tony finally got his way. For the next 2 years, he walked himself back and forth to school. It was an 8-block walk with many streets to cross. But he was careful. He didn't talk to strangers or get distracted along the way. Years later, at a family party, he bragged about his independence as a boy and reminded his family of how he had taken care of himself as a boy. His mother just began to laugh and added the rest of the story. Tony, did you really think you were alone? She asked. Every morning when you left for school, I left with you. I walked behind you all the way. When you got out of school at 3:30 in the afternoon, I was there. I always kept myself hidden, but I was there and followed you all the way home. I just wanted to be there in case you needed me. Isn't that just like God? And my friend, this morning, I don't care where you're walking to or from, God's presence walks with you. He has promised never to leave you. Notice the second thing Paul declared. It's found in verse 24. The angel said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. The angel said, God has a plan for you, Paul, and this storm is not going to change or stop the plan of God for your life. God has an appointment for you, Paul, standing before Caesar, and this storm is not going to stop you getting there. How many of you realize God has a plan and a purpose for our lives? How many of you realize that God has a will for each and every one of us? And the storms that come in our life are simply things we've got to go through in completing and finishing and fulfilling the work and plan and will of God for our life. Paul stood up and says, listen, God's got a plan for my life. I'm going to stand before Caesar, and this storm's not going to take me down. This storm's not going to destroy me because God is bigger than this storm, and he has a plan, and he's going to fulfill that plan in my life. As a young pastor, many times, I've pastored several churches, the last one for 35 years. I can remember many times crying out to God, God, I can't do it. The problems are too big. The opposition is too much. God, I can't do it any longer. Many times I prayed that prayer, and every time God said to me, he said, Vance, listen to me. He said, did I call you? I'd say, yes, Lord, you did. I know that you did. Did I send you here? Yes, Lord, I know that you did. Have I released you yet? No, Lord, you haven't. Get up and keep going. Get up and keep going. For I have called you for this place at this hour, at this time. Don't let the storms or the difficulties or the problems deter you from the will that I have for your life. Paul stands up and says, fellas, we're going to make it because God has a plan for my life and a purpose for me. And then last of all, I want you to see the third anchor that anchored Paul. It's found in verse 25. It says, keep up your courage, men.
for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. You know what? He said, men, take courage because God keeps his word. I believe God is faithful. God has never failed me yet, and storms cannot change the faithfulness of God. I don't care how dark the sky is or the difficult the circumstances, storms cannot change the faithfulness of God. And maybe you face a storm like that seems impossible. Maybe you face circumstances that seem to be bigger. You may lose your cargo, you may lose the ship, you may be even wet. But my friend, God will be faithful to his word in our lives and our hearts, and we can stand. You know what? This morning, I believe God will do exactly as he said he will do. God is faithful. And Paul stood up before them and said, listen, folks, take courage. My God said, I'm going to make it to Rome. I know God's going to do what he said he'll do. Later, Paul would write to his son Timothy in the Lord, 1 Timothy 1:12, and say, I know in whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against. I know in whom I believe. He is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. My God will see me all the way home. But this morning, I don't know the circumstances of your lives. I don't know what you face. I don't know the difficulties, the challenges. I don't know. But if you're in a storm this morning, if you're facing a hard time, a hard place, I want to tell you to do two things. I want to tell you to do two things. Hear me this morning. It's drop anchor and pray. Drop anchor and pray. Now, prayer is the response to every storm that comes into our lives. Men ought always to pray. Luke chapter 18. Men ought always to pray. In everything with prayer and thanksgiving, supplication, I make my request in the name of God. Prayer is the response to everything. But drop anchor when you pray. Drop the anchor. God, I know you're with me. God, I know your presence is there. God, I know it is. I know you're here. I know you hear me. Drop anchor. I know, God, you have a plan and a purpose for my life. This season, this darkness, this storm is just a road bump, Lord, because you have a plan and a purpose for my life. And drop anchor in the faithfulness of God to do what he said he will do. If you will drop those anchors and allow them to ground you in the midst of the storm swirling around you, and you will seek the face of God, I am here to tell you this morning that God can see you through any storm you face. Drop anchor and pray. Paul will later write to the Ephesians. He will say, now unto him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all I could ask or think. Now unto him, he can do more than I can even dream of. He will take care of me and lead me through the storm. Let me conclude this morning with this simple story. If God can lead this simple preacher through the greatest storm I ever faced, he can take care of you in the midst of yours. It was a Friday morning, about 10 o'clock. I'd had prayer with the men of my church as I did every Friday morning, every week, every month. We'd gone for coffee, and then I'd gone to the hospital to visit a lady who was dying, a sister of a lady in our church. Spent some time praying with her, reading the word to her and her family. I'd come back to the church and was making last-minute preparations for, in the morning on Saturday at 7 o'clock, we were leaving out of Wichita, 25 of us from our church, for a missions construction trip in the mountains of Ecuador. I had about $5,000 in my briefcase. I had the airline ticket. I had all the confirmations of everything. Everything was there. I made last-minute preparations. So about 10 or 10:30, I felt a little congestion in my heart, in my chest, like I've had a cold. I better call my doctor and get an antibiotic. I don't want to come down with a cold while I'm on this trip in the mountains of Ecuador. So I called my doctor and said, could you give me an antibiotic? I feel like I'm coming down with a little bit of a cold. I'm going on a trip tomorrow, and I just don't want to get sick while I'm gone. My doctor said, well, we need to see you. We can't just give it to you without seeing you. And so, well, okay. But your doctor is booked today,
But at 1 o'clock, you can see a new young doctor in our practice here. At 1 o'clock, you can see him. All I needed was an antibiotic. I didn't care who gave it to me. So I said, I'll see him. I drove, left all the stuff with my secretary. I drove across town to my doctor's office. It's an office of about 6, 8 doctors. I walked in there just before 1 o'clock, and on a Friday afternoon, there was nobody in the waiting room. I walked right up to the counter, told who I was, ushered right back to see this young Dr. Miller. Dr. Miller said, Reverend, your chest is clear. You don't have any congestion in your chest at all. But let me give you an EKG just to make sure it's not your heart that's giving you any problems. I've not really had any problems with my heart. I've been checked many times, not had any problems at all, no symptoms. I'm healthy. My friend, I'm going on a construction trip. I'm 49 years old. I'm in great shape. Okay, do it. So he ran an EKG, a simple little procedure, had several of them in the past. He went out of the room. He came back just a few minutes later and said, Reverend, he said, I know I've never seen you before, but this EKG was a little different than the last one I saw in your records. And I took the liberty to call your cardiologist, who is in your records, and I think you need to have a treadmill test. We just need to make sure that there's nothing wrong with your heart before you go on to this trip. And I don't really think there is, but we need to make sure. I'd had many treadmill tests before, and I thought, okay, that's no problem. But my cardiologist was not working that afternoon. And so another cardiologist in the group said he would see me at 3 o'clock. So this is about 1:30, 2 o'clock. So I get in the car, drive across town to the cardiologist's office. It's a group of about 5 doctors. I walk in. There's nobody in the waiting room. There's nobody there but the nurse behind the desk. I walk in, say who I am. I'm ushered back. I meet Dr. Zepik. He's a wonderful Christian man. He just returned from Israel, and I've been to Israel many times. We talked about Israel as I'm walking the treadmill. I've had several treadmill tests, just checking up and making sure your heart's okay. We talked. When he finished, he said, Reverend, I know I'm not your cardiologist, but looking at this treadmill result and the last one you had, it's a little different. Now, if you were my patient, what I would do is schedule you in the next week for a heart cath. That's really the only way, the definitive way we can check and make sure there's nothing wrong with your heart. And I said, but I know you're leaving in the morning at 7 o'clock with your men to spend the day. So here's the first decision I've had all day. He said, Reverend, I can give you some medicine and we can send you on your way. Or let's try to get a heart cath room tonight. And it's only about a 15-minute procedure. I've had one before. He said, we can check it if everything, I believe everything's okay. I don't see really any problem. But if everything's okay, you can be on your way and on your way to your trip. Now, what do you think your wife would say if you said, just give me the medicine and let me go, as opposed to having the heart cath that night? I said, Doc, if I want to live to see tomorrow, I better just have the heart cath tonight, because when my wife finds out, that's what she would say. She says, okay, good. So he calls the hospital I go to. No heart cath rooms available. Now, this is 4 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. No heart cath rooms available that night. Call this hospital, the largest hospital in Wichita. He called it. No heart cath rooms available that night. He called the third hospital, the last one in Wichita, and he found a heart cath lab room, surgical room, available at 5 o'clock. This is 3:30. He says, Reverend, jump in your car, drive over to the hospital, get checked in. I'll be right behind you, and we'll do this cath. Things will be fine. It'll be over. You'll be out of there. You'll be home. You'll be able to go on your trip tomorrow. I said, great, let's do it. So then I'm calling my wife as I drive over. Honey, I just wanted you to know I'm on my way to the hospital. This. So she met me there. It's the first time I talked to her. Got to the hospital, large hospital in Wichita, walked into the admitting. There was nobody in the admitting room at all. As I walked up to the desk, the nurse, I kidded with her and I said, man, you had to work overtime just waiting on me. And kidding back, she said, yes, I'm just here waiting on you. Well, they checked me in, took my pants, gave me one of those gowns, as you all understand, and took me up for a heart cath that evening at 5 o'clock. After that simple 15-minute procedure, I got the greatest shock of my life. Dr. Zepik said to me, he said, Reverend, he trembled as he said it. He said, Reverend, you have 3 very serious and complete blockages in the arteries around your heart, and I cannot understand why you've not had a massive heart attack to this point. Mind you, I've had no symptoms. Mind you, I've had no difficulty, no pain, no whatever I'm a healthy, strong young man. He said, you need surgery. You need bypass surgery, and you need it right now. I said, right now? He said, right now. Do you know a heart surgeon? So I pulled out my list of heart surgeons. No. I said, I don't know a heart surgeon. He said, let me suggest one to you. He called a man, and he's in the cath room. I'm laying on the table. He's talking to the surgeon. He says, I want you to come by and look at this case. I think you'll do surgery for him tonight. And I heard that doctor say, no, send him up to ICU. We'll do surgery first thing on Monday morning. I don't like to do surgeries on Saturdays or Sundays. And Dr. Zeppik said, no, you'll come and look at his case right now, or I think you'll do surgery right now. A little bit later, they took me up to ICU. A couple of hours later, the surgeon comes in, Hispanic man. I'd only met him then. I only saw him once after my surgery. He's not in practice anymore, but he had a large gold cross, 6 inches, hanging around his neck. And he said to me, Reverend, I don't like to do surgery on Saturday or Sunday, but in looking at your case, we're going to do your surgery right now in just a few hours. He says, rest a little bit. They'll be in to get you, and then we'll be doing surgery in just a few hours. And at the very time my team of 25 men were on a plane leaving out of Wichita for Ecuador, I was in surgery, open heart surgery, triple bypass surgery. Very successful. A few days later in the hospital, my cardiologist sat on the side of my bed. And he said to me, Reverend, when I saw your heart cath and the severity of your blockages, I was afraid you would have a massive heart attack before I could get you to surgery. I could not understand why you had not had one to this point. But Reverend, if you'd have gotten on that plane with your team, it is my learned opinion they would have brought you back in a box. And my friend, if God, who holds my hand, can stop a preacher who's going lickety-split to do something, and in the midst of 24 hours, stopping in his tracks. I went to all those doctor's appointments. There was not a person in the waiting room. It was as though God sent angels ahead of me. It says, clear out the way. I'm sending somebody through here on a fast track. I never saw a doctor of my own, but every doctor I saw was a Christian man, and I'm still in contact with, other than the surgeon, today. And God spared and delivered me from a storm I never knew was coming, but was looming big on my horizon. And my friends, I simply say to you, well, I'm not in the storm today, Pastor. My things are great with me. I simply say to you, drop anchor and pray. God is with you every day, all the time. He has a plan and a purpose. He had a plan and a purpose that has been 20 years ago today. Not today, but this year, 20 years that I had that done. The doctor told me that you, because of such a young age, the condition of your heart, you will have to have bypass surgery again in 10 to 15 years, depending on how you live. It's been 20 years, and I just saw Dr. Zeppik, my cardiologist, a couple of weeks ago. He said, Reverend, you don't need anything yet. Because you see, God's presence walks with me. God has a plan and a purpose for my life. And God does what he says he will do. And if you will hang on to those anchors, you can see your way